All right, we are now live for the first of our philosophy pop-ups for the month of June. I'm going to wait a little bit while people arrive. And before I do that, let me say thanks to all of my Patreon supporters who make this possible. And this month, I'm going to focus on, let's call it, issues of the body and how things go right or wrong with the body from a philosophical perspective, or rather perspectives. I'm going to talk a bit about the Stoics, a bit about existentialists, a bit about Platonism and Cartesian dualism, and also about Aristotle. So it looks like we already have quite a few people here. A number of people saying hello to all of you. I've been thinking a lot about the body. My son you'll see him popping up from time to time as he's trying to watch this on the floor and not get in frame. My son is hoping to become a YouTuber himself, and he actually helps me edit videos and is now helping me edit some of the podcast things as well. So, all right, back to what I was talking about. We've had a lot of things going on in the Sadler Shaka household in terms of bodies and health and various vulnerabilities. We have two old dogs, 12 and 13, who have, really gone beyond their life expectancy, and things are starting to go wrong in different ways. So, we're getting to see that. It's not as if I haven't seen that with a lot of other pets before in the past, or as if my wife hasn't, but, it's staring us in the face daily. I've been working out quite a lot since really about February, trying to get in anywhere from 3 to 6 workouts a week. And I'll talk about my motivation for that in a moment. It's very different in my 40s than it was in my teens and 20s, or even my 30s. But, things are actually getting better for me in terms of like endurance and how much I can actually exercise and physical lifting. And I've been doing physical therapy for some things that I should have had, looked at a while ago. But for my wife, things have been kind of rough recently. She tore her meniscus in an exercise class of all places, and then tried to get through it, and finally went to the doctor, and the doctor looked at it and said, yeah, you've got a torn meniscus. So we started doing the regimen of no stairs, icing, staying off of it as much as possible. And it's really tough for her. She can't catch a break when it comes to this sort of thing, because then she injured it even worse. And at our age, in our late 40s, when things start to get screwed up with joints and all that, there's no such thing like for a ligament as a partial tear, as I found out when I tore 2 of the ligaments in my left knee several years ago. The doctor looked at me and said, yeah, those exist for 20-year-olds. It's pretty rare that you find them for people in their 40s. And so, I just go without 2 ligaments. The muscles adjust for it, and I try to avoid, making sharp turns. So that may be what we've got in store for her as well. And these are the sorts of things that as you're getting older, right, you have to start taking stock of. And so here's where the philosophy part comes in. I think when it comes to what we can call philosophies of life, or practical philosophies, those sorts of things that have to do with aging and injuries and health in general are quite important. If we're thinking in terms of, say, existentialism focuses on the human condition, and it looks for the things that really do in fact affect our lives, the things that we are drawn to or pushed away from, the things that involve our passions. By the way, not looking for any medical advice from anybody here. So I should have mentioned that from the beginning. Every time I post about this, I get people, giving me all sorts of unsolicited advice. We're just fine as it is with that. So, but yeah, so going back to sort of thinking about things existentially, and in this, the existentialists were really doing the same sort of thing that philosophers had been doing for 2 millennia, thinking about the things that really matter to the human condition, not just in terms of, theoretical topics, but very practical topics. So how does the world change for you when you can no longer get around quite as well? I mean, Heidegger has this great stuff on mood, and Aristotle. I mean, some of it is actually coming out of Aristotle's rhetoric. Aristotle talks about this, and if you think about it, the world of the angry person is not the same thing as the world of the sad person or the joyful person or the person who is focused primarily on care. And it's similar for encumbrances, or for, like for myself, as I'm regaining strength that I haven't had for a long time, new things become possible. The world starts to get perceived in a different way. And so I wanted to talk a bit about, different ways in which philosophy either takes account of the body or totally discounts the body. And there is one question in there that Robert is asking, are we our bodies or our minds? So that's a great jumping off point, right? In some ways, we're both. If you want to ask my view on it, we are our bodies. Our bodies are inextricable from who we are, but we're not just our bodies, right? The mind is not simply reducible to the body. And you notice that even some of the materialists that are out there, some of them will at least say, well, yeah, whatever is going on is material, but our conception of materialism is far too reductive if we think it's what science can reveal to us or something like that. So the Stoics, for example, are materialists, but they think that what we call mind or spirit, or however you want to think about it, in Greek, psyche, and in pneuma also, in Latin, animus. If you think about those sorts of things, they would have to be something material, but they're not something reducible to the material of just what we look at as the body. There would be something more to it as well. And then, of course, at another extreme, we have dualistic positions like that of Plato, where the body and the soul are something really different from each other. It's a little bit difficult to figure out exactly how they interact. That's one of the big problems for substance dualism. Not one, by the way, I'm going to try to resolve in this session here, right? Because there's a lot of people working on that, and none of the solutions that people have come up with have gained universal consensus as being good ones. So, if they can't do it, I'm certainly not going to do it myself. But that's another extreme position where the body and the soul or mind, whoever you want to call it, are separate. And Descartes uses the metaphor of the pilot in the ship, just sort of moving it around. And if we adopt that sort of position towards the body, I tend to think that there's a plus side to it, which is, non-reductionism, where we're not simply saying, well, whatever you've got going on with you, it's really a matter of what's going on in your bodily states or your brain states or something like that. That's good. But it does tend to lead to discounting how important the body is for us, and in particular, the body that we've got, because you really only get one of them. And there were a lot of people when I was in my teens and 20s who were like, maybe don't exercise like that, or maybe don't do that sort of thing, because it's going to have bad effects on your body over time. And of course, my answer to them was, I'll be fine. Shut up, old person. And now I'm that old person who routinely winds up saying, oh, I think they were right, and sometimes giving advice like that as well to other people. So, substance dualism, that tends to lead to discounting the body. Interestingly, it doesn't have to. Somebody like Descartes was really interested in looking at the body as a very complex machine. He, we think of him primarily for like the cogito ergo sum and all that, but that's just the very beginning of the discourse and the meditations. You want to read all the rest of the stuff, because what you notice him doing throughout that is developing some sort of basis for certainty for modern science. And he thought that if we could just get the metaphysics right, we could get the physics right, and then from there we can get 3 M's right, which are mechanics, medicine, and morality. And all of those could be looked at in a sort of mechanistic fashion, which he did. He was, in effect, not just a philosopher, but a natural scientist. He carried out a lot of experiments. He spent a lot of time trying to add to our stock of knowledge, not just in natural science too, but also in mathematics. So, dualism doesn't have to lead to discounting the body, but often it does. There's other ways of looking at the body as well. The Aristotelian tradition, well, they always had kind of a difficult time. Aristotle himself said that the soul is the form of the body. And when the body dies, the soul itself is just going to end. Maybe there'll be a survival of something called the active intellect, but that's really impersonal, and that there it gets very, very murky. Anybody who tells you that they know exactly what Aristotle's position on that is BSing you, because I routinely, every year, I go to the Aristotle conference here at Marquette, which is coming up this week, or later this month, and we bat around the ideas about this. Aristotle scholars themselves are not in full agreement about it. And then the Aristotelian tradition, gets absorbed by various theistic thinkers who want to, have some sort of understanding of the soul as being something more than just the body, or more than just the form of the body. And it takes a lot of work to try to figure out exactly how that's going to work. But we have the interesting Muslim theologians and philosophers tackling that. We have the whole Thomistic tradition. There's actually an incorporation of Aristotelianism in other traditions. I'd like to also talk about the Stoics. The Stoics might be seen as people who also discount the body. They're not substance dualists, but they really do place this priority on the soul as opposed to the body, which is very Socratic, right? Socrates is constantly saying, focus on improving your soul. Don't worry so much about your body or your social position or things like that. And the Stoics also have this thing called the dichotomy of control that some of you are probably familiar with, which is one important doctrine, but not the only doctrine of Stoicism. And a lot of people get the dichotomy of control wrong because they only read Enchiridion 1 and then don't read the rest of the stuff that Epictetus is saying about it. Here's what the dichotomy is, right? Epictetus says some things are in our control or in our power, epumon, by the way, a phrase that occurs in Aristotle too, in his discussions of what's in our control. And then there's other things that are not in our control, right? And those would be things like property or social position or any of those sorts of things. But Epictetus also includes our bodies. Why? Because our bodies are sort of an interface. Oh, there's my son again, crawling around. You can see him. Matt, just get up if you're going to be here. So he's participating a little bit in the session. He's trying to stay out of frame, but not succeeding in it. So the Stoics, they say the body is something that's not really in our control. That doesn't mean that we don't have any control whatsoever. It doesn't mean that we don't control whether we eat crappy food or eat good food, exercise, don't exercise, avoid like getting it injured or anything like that. And the Stoics view the body as something that's, strictly speaking, external to our minds. But that doesn't mean that the body doesn't, in fact, affect our minds. And that doesn't mean that we don't have to take what they call care or attention or, have proper use, chresis in Greek, of the body. As a matter of fact, use of externals is something that's in our control, Epictetus says, and it's very central that we attend to that sort of thing. So the Stoics would say, listen, you get this one body, and by the way, when that dies, that's pretty much you dying. I mean, there's a few speculations about maybe parts of your body will survive afterwards, right? But in general, dying is that's it. So you really ought to attend to it, correctly. You shouldn't do things that are harmful to it. you should take care of it like you would any other good instrument, so that it's handy when you want to do something with it. And you have to understand that it's going to age, and it's going to break down over time. Existentialists also have very interesting perspectives on the body. And, the ones that, like Gabriel Marcel is somebody who I draw a lot from. And Marcel, has this great discussion about the difference between being and having. And he talks about our body as not just something that we have, like, possession. We are our bodies. We're not just our bodies, but we do have to take account of the kinds of bodies that we have, and we need to attend to them. So health is something that you would focus on from a philosophical perspective if we're talking about philosophy of life. I know there's a lot of philosophers out there who are, on the one hand, terrible models for that, and on the other hand, seem not to talk about that at all. They talk about it as if we're just these, disembodied minds, or in these very abstract ways. But that's that's not everybody. Vulnerability too. This is something I'll start taking questions in just a moment. This is something I wanted to bring up in this. So, the world will drive home to you sooner or later the vulnerability of your body to all sorts of things. Our bodies are the interface between us, whatever we are, and the totality of existence. And being able to participate in existence means being able to be hurt and damaged, and sometimes without even realizing it. I'll give you an example of somebody who was wounded years and years before she actually felt it. A friend of my mother's, Marcy Butler, who my mother went to school with, she hurt her Achilles tendon when she was a girl, and it never quite healed up properly. And she forgot about it entirely. And then when she was in her 40s, one day she was walking along, and it just snapped. And of course, if your Achilles goes, that's it for your leg for the time being. And of course, she collapsed, and she was like, "What the hell was this?" And she went to the doctor, and the doctor said, "Not much we can do about this, unfortunately." This was back in the 1980s or 1990s. Maybe they could do something about it now. Maybe they'll graft a new one or something like that. But it really did not turn out well for her. She had to walk with a cane and all that. And how would she know that was latent within her all this time? There's so many things like that where we don't really grasp until it happens, the vulnerability of our body. I'll tell you, I mentioned that I'm missing two ligaments in my left knee. We were out at Montauk on the beach. There's actually a video about this way back. You can take a look at it if you want to. And, we were in the spray, and the waves are kind of high. And I turned because my daughter was coming to talk to me about something, and I was still in it, and I got hit by a wave, and something went the wrong way. And suddenly I was in terrible pain, and I was getting washed up on the beach and trying to get up, and the leg just going out from under me. Because of course, the knee had lost 2 out of its 4 main ligaments. So it was just flopping around. And, well, that was quite a shock, and then that also led to having to wear a brace and walk with a crutch for an entire semester. And that really changes the way that you look at things as well, trying to do grocery shopping with crutches, for example. So I think that's probably enough about that. Let me start scrolling up and looking at all these great questions and comments. Andrew asked thoughts on meditation. I've tried it in the past. I'm not much of a meditator. Some people have a much easier time doing that than others. My mind tends to get particularly active, and I have indeed tried it. I've actually gone to classes, and it just doesn't do that much for me. If I'm going to meditate on something, I need something that has a bit of structure, so, and the other trouble is I don't really find the time to do all that much about it. Valdemar, have you read Hans Blumenberg, The Legitimacy of the Modern Age? I don't think I have. All right. Zana, what sort of advice would I give to someone who truly feels they've lost interest in their job and try something more fitting to their body or mind? Well, so that's a great question. That's the sort of thing where, in order to really give great, useful advice about it, I would need to know more about the person and their situation and all that. But I can say a few generic things. I do think it's kind of common to lose interest in jobs that you're doing. Sometimes it's just for a short amount of time. Sometimes it's like permanent. You never regain that interest. And it's possible to do jobs that you are bored by or hate for years and years and years. I know some of my relatives did that. You can do it out of a sense of duty or because you need to earn money. But it takes a toll on you. And it is a good thing to try, especially in our society where we do have some degree of social mobility, or at least, lateral mobility where you can move around and we're not like stuck in some caste or guild or something like that once and for all for the rest of our life. It is good to look at other alternatives. I think if you're doing that, you don't want to, a lot of people, and this goes not just for jobs, but for relationships and a lot of other things. A lot of people sort of like run from one crappy situation into what appears not to be one, but on the surface looks to be quite good, but turns out to be another and another and another. So I think it's important to like sit down and think about what is it that you're actually looking for? What would make you feel like you're engaged or enjoying things? By the way, they did this survey a few years back and found that something like 80% of employees here in the United States are not engaged, meaning emotionally engaged in their work, and that a good portion of them actually hate the jobs that they do. So this is a real problem, a real issue, and that can take a toll on your body. Having to do work that you find irritating or boring or something like that. Not only does it affect your mental state, but it can lead to all sorts of other things, like people start overeating, having snacks just to fill the time, or doing habits that could be destructive to their bodies or their minds, or just in some respects falling in with the wrong crowd at work. People who are also downers and they're like, this place sucks. I've seen that happen a lot in academic situations. So it's a good question. Alejandro asks, what are my thoughts on Foucault's archaeological method? I've been reading a lot of his work and finding him quite interesting. Have you read Les Mots et les Choses or The Order of Things? Yes, I studied him back in graduate school and actually demonstrated to the class that, despite his claims to not be a structuralist, Foucault actually uses a Gramscian square in The Order of Things without attributing it to Gramsci. So what do I think about his archaeological method? I think that Foucault often has interesting things to say. I think that you almost never want to take Foucault as providing us a full perspective on things. I mean, I don't know how many criminologists, I had say to me that, while Discipline and Punish is great for talking about a few prisons, it's not helpful and actually screwed up the discourse when it came to many other prisons as well. I think that The Order of Things and the Archaeology of Knowledge, because we're really talking about that period of time, they're interesting works. And I think Foucault is somebody who you can sort of partially appropriate. The most interesting work that gets done using Foucault is usually not by philosophers, but by like sociologists and city planners and people like that who use some of his ideas and then say, well, the rest of this stuff, we're going to throw this crap out. So, yeah. Adam, do you know why Socrates says he knows nothing? Because there's nothing to know. Socrates is free from the illusion of knowing. No. Socrates only said that he knows that he knows nothing, and in that very dialogue he also shows that he knows all sorts of other things. So you have to take that as an ironic statement. So many people have made far too much out of that, and they've been, carelessly attending to only that part of the text, the part that they liked, and not paying attention to all the other places in the texts where Socrates says, well, as we all know, right? And then they agree with him. So, yeah, I mean, if you want to be that sort of uber skeptic, that's great, but it's sort of like solipsism. You got to do that on your own. Nobody else is really going to do much of that with you. So, all right. Reed, do you think Chomsky is right in his commentary about the limits of human understanding? Are science overly optimistic? How do we improve the dialogue between philosophy and science? So I can't really say much about the Chomsky stuff. It's been years since I read him. I never found him, when it came even to the linguistic stuff, to be all that interesting. I mean, there's sort of his linguistic stuff and consciousness stuff, and then there's the politics stuff. His politics stuff is more interesting, but he's basically, just a hard leftist who, is an equal opportunity critic of both sides, which is great. You always know exactly where he's coming from. You can often predict what he's going to say when it comes out. Now, are scientists overly optimistic? Sometimes. It depends on what you're asking about. They seem, it depends on the scientist and it depends on the discipline, but yeah, some are overly optimistic about what science is going to achieve for us, but that's been going on for, 500 years. Part of the problem is that scientists, and this is not just about scientists or even STEM people, the humanities disciplines are terrible with this as well. They often haven't read enough. They often don't know the history of their discipline, and they don't realize when they're sort of replicating the same old thing that was done with this movement back in the 1850s, where if you looked at that and you're like, oh, that's how they wound up in a dead end, and here's what we're saying, that's just a new version of that. Maybe we should be careful about this. Like I said, that doesn't just happen in the sciences, though. That happens in the humanities, happens all the time in education, happens all the time in business. It's kind of a human condition. Santayana gets quoted, those who don't remember history are doomed to repeat it. And that's true. It's not just they're doomed to repeat it, they're also doomed to repeat it and not realize that they're doing the same damn thing, just under a different guise, and that it's probably going to have not exactly the same results, but it's going to hit the same cul-de-sacs and dead ends. So yeah, optimism by itself isn't a bad thing. It often sort of drives science. We might even talk about a certain faith that scientists have, which Nietzsche was really great at diagnosing in his works. Nietzsche saw the scientists as essentially the new theologians. And I think he's still right about that. How do we improve the dialogue between philosophy and science? Well, that's a good question. I would say that a good portion of that depends on further study. Like scientists need to actually read some philosophy and not just read it to get it read and get it done and have some talking points, but to actually thoughtfully read it. And philosophers, for their part, need to know what the hell they're talking about when they are straying into other areas. They need to. Philosophers probably also need to avoid, doing the sort of gotcha stuff, very clever, little articles on this and that, because that's not really helpful for anybody. Or nowadays, opinion pieces, right? But I don't have a lot of great suggestions for that. The one thing I will say is every discipline, there's no such thing as philosophy and science to begin with. There's philosophies and all sorts of sciences, and within those sciences, there's all different, approaches. So, it's very difficult to generalize about these things as a whole. I mean, you might say the same thing about philosophy and theology, or anything else. I mean, even philosophy and food studies, right? Food studies itself is a heterogeneous set of disciplines put together. So it often depends on which models we're looking at. All right, there's a thing about Tai Chi in here, which I'm going to skip over. My son Matt is chiming in, saying nice things. Thomas writes, do you think there's been a kind of Christian moralistic denigration, devaluation of the importance of bodily well-being and beauty in favor of the soul, worth reasserting its aesthetic importance and importance for eudaimonic life. I wouldn't call it Christian. I mean, you can denigrate the importance of bodily well-being and beauty from all sorts of perspectives. And I mean, if you want to associate it with particular movements within Christianity, sure, I can agree to that. But if you're going to just say it's somehow Christian in some giant essence of Christianity sense, I think that's probably bad history of ideas. Because you can find as many counterexamples in various Christian strains of thought and practice as well. Is it worth reasserting the aesthetic importance of the bodily well-being and beauty? No, it's worth refining it because there's already in our culture a massive emphasis on that. I mean, think about how many glossy ads there are in magazines showing you these models that have essentially almost alien to human nature bodies, right? As an ideal, and the poor kids and older people too who internalize these ideals, and we've got them for everybody, right? We've got every sort of niche covered. You're into bodybuilding. Well, there's muscle and fitness for you, right? You're into decking yourself out in clothes. Well, there's this magazine. I don't know, which one it would be. No, we already have enough emphasis on it. It's a matter of getting it right. It's a matter of steering it away from sort of unrealistic ideals and towards more realistic goals. And thinking about the interface between body and mind that goes beyond just going to yoga classes and doing namaste to people and silliness like that, but actually thinking about it. I mean, when somebody tells me, oh, I practice yoga, my first thing is, great, what do you think of Patanjali? And they're always like, Patan what? Is that like a neti pot? And Patanjali wrote the Yoga Sutras, right? So if you're doing yoga, you probably should read about the ethical discipline of yoga, but a lot of people aren't. But we could be bringing some new emphasis to that, and it could reach out to all sorts of areas. I mean, I look at exercise now myself as something that I do so that my bones are going to remain dense and my muscles will not atrophy and perhaps even regain enough strength for me to be able to handle the situations of life that I have to do, like carrying a dog down stairs when there's a fire alarm, or being able to throw my son up on top of my shoulders, or moving boxes when I need to. And I think that sort of thing for me at my age is probably much more important than having a six-pack. But when I was in my 20s, that sort of thing mattered to me. But we could ask, well, why do you want a six-pack? What does that signify to you? How does that interface with the rest of your life? Are you doing exercises that are just trying to bring out, sort of a refinement, or are you doing something that actually reflects genuine bodily health? Because trying to get a six-pack could be either way, right? I mean, you see these guys who do this work, with machines or with free weights, and they're trying to just work on this one little muscle here, and you're like, man, you could be spending that time doing a useful exercise, not something that's just for show. But if you say it like that, you're probably not going to get them. There's probably better ways to do it. So is there, again, going back to this, worth reasserting its aesthetic importance? Yeah, and importance for eudaimonic life. I think when people are getting caught in those things, it's because they don't have a good understanding of what eudaimonia or happiness would really be. And you could say, well, they need to learn. Yeah, but who's teaching them? Are they getting introduced to that by the people doing professional philosophy? Not much, unfortunately. Are they getting it from the popular culture? Not often. They're usually getting bad messages instead. So, we could think about, is there a role for that? All right, let's go on. Reed, do you have advice on how to stay focused on life goals? And by focused, I mean a more kind of devotion than short-term focus. So a longer-term thing. Yeah. There's a couple things I could say. One is it really is helpful to find other people who share those goals and view them as important, so you can prop each other up and have accountability, and have somebody else who you can talk with about those things, not just about your successes but about your failures. Um, and of course, you don't want somebody who's like, "Oh, you failed," right? You want somebody who's actually going to be supportive, but who is going to hold you accountable. So that's one thing. Another thing is, for a lot of people, it can be very helpful to write these things out or put, like a poster on the wall. And I'm not talking about like a motivational poster. I'm talking about like something where you would actually chart out your goals and think about your biggest goals, and then how all these, smaller, we could call operational goals, actually fit in with it. And you can remind yourself of where you want to be. You can also, do the opposite too, and say, remind yourself of where you don't want to be, or where you don't want to be stuck. The things that you don't want to fall into. I'll give you an example, right? So the weightlifting for me, I do the circuit training, right? And I'm not doing free weights or something like that, because I'm interested in getting in, doing my weight stuff, getting out of there, because I got stuff to do. And I don't find lifting weights all that interesting anymore, like I used to when I was young. Why am I doing it? Well, it's primarily for, making sure my bones stay in good shape and building some muscle that I'm going to need for the stuff that I'm doing. And I can remind myself, well, if I don't do that, then I'm probably not going to live as long. And the life that I have when I'm in my 60s and 70s is not going to be as productive or as pleasant, because I didn't take care of myself. So if you do that sort of thing, I think that can be helpful. Maybe you set a certain time every day to remind yourself of what your goals are, and think about how you're making them, how you're doing with your goals. All right. Democritus, Dr. Sadler, for someone who has a great deal of frustration in organizing, there's the key word, my literary, philosophical, and theological studies. Do you have any advice for an Ariadnes thread? So, unfortunately, I do not. And let's talk about the Ariadnes thread. It's like, so that Ariadne was the daughter of Minos. Minos, you should associate with the Minotaur, right? The Minotaur was at the center of a maze called the Labyrinth, designed by Daedalus. And by a little side note, after the Minotaur is dead, Daedalus and his son Icarus are going to be imprisoned in the labyrinth. Now, Ariadne's thread, Ariadne gives Theseus like a ball of twine or yarn or whatever it was, and he leaves a little thread behind him so he can find his way back out of the maze after he's killed the Minotaur. Is there an Ariadne's thread like that for studying? Unfortunately, no. The world is much more complicated. Oftentimes, it is also sometimes called a royal road, right? Another metaphor. You will never find a way of organizing your studies that is not to some degree arbitrary, and that's okay. Human knowledge and sort of human reflection on the world and ourselves is so immense and complicated and so self-referential that any organizational system that we come up with is always going to be imperfect to some degree. You're always going to be like, I don't know if this belongs over here or belongs over here. You just have to have some sort of way of organizing it so you can find what you need when you need it, and you don't go nuts. It's more pragmatic than anything else. So, but I totally understand the motivation, because I don't know how many times I've reorganized bookshelves, for example, right? Or my papers or things like that. So I understand that frustration. Kanagelvi, is it fair to say Aristotle views working out as an act of bravery or courage? I don't know that Aristotle would necessarily say that. I mean, it could be something you could say it's it could be like an integral part of a larger act of courage. Courage could also be involved. Here's some examples, right? If you have a very bodily conscious and sort of feeling insecure about how you look, which I've certainly gone through myself. I'm overweight. I'm older. Um, you know, Especially when you start working out, you see these people doing exercises and you're struggling just to do a little bit of it, right? You're on the elliptical and you're huffing and puffing away while these other younger people are really going to town. That could bother you. That could give you a sense of fear, a sense of embarrassment, and like pushing through that. That could require some courage. So I guess that could sometimes be it. But routinely working out, probably not. You think of it more as like developing the instrument that you're going to need for your courage, which is your body, right? And your capacity to endure. Now, would Stoics view it as courage? So the Stoic conception of courage is a little bit different than the Aristotelian one. I mean, the Stoic conception of virtue is different too. It's not always a mean between extremes, although sometimes it is for Cicero and Seneca. There's sort of an off-on thing, like you're virtuous or you're vicious. There's nothing in between. That's very different than Aristotle. And the Stoic conception of courage is quite broad. Courage or fortitude, right? Andrea or fortitudo in Latin and Greek. So pushing through the difficult exercises would in fact be courage for the Stoics. Not a huge example of it, but some. Aristotle, the place to look for a discussion of this would be in Book 7 of the Nicomachean Ethics. Because Aristotle talks about endurance, karateia, which means, it's sort of the mirror image of kratia, self-mastery. Kratia is strictly speaking with respect to pleasures, not being mastered by pleasures. Karateia, endurance, is the same thing, but with respect to pains. And working out, it's not like you get in the machine and you're like, oh my God, I can't, this is so pleasurable. I can't keep myself from doing another set. No, it's the opposite. You're like, oh, Jesus. Can I actually get through this set? Can I do the 12 reps I'm supposed to do? Oh, now I've got another set after this. It's dealing with pain or trouble, right? So, all right, Adam, what are the difficulties of learning Greek? Is it necessary to learn ancient Greek to read Plato and others? I mean, not really. I mean, if you want to read Plato, there's plenty of great translations out there. You just got to be able to trust the translation. You can compare different translations against each other. Learning Greek is like learning any other language. You got to put in a lot of time, and it's there are things that are going to be unfamiliar to you as an English speaker. Like case structure. I mean, it's great to do it because then you learn a lot of, stems, you learn a lot of grammar that actually does apply to English and other languages. And then, if you're doing Indo-European languages and you learn Greek, it's going to be easier for you to learn Latin or easier for you to learn German, whether it's contemporary German or whether it's like, any of the older languages like Gothic or, Middle High German or stuff like that. But you got to put in time every day. There's different methods for doing it. They don't all work out the same for different people. I'm a bit of an outlier when it comes to that. So what works for me probably won't work for a lot of other people. So I don't have a lot of great advice for that. Andrew, I've just recently discovered your channel and can't thank you enough. Well, thanks. It's very nice of you to say that. So glad that you enjoy it. So at Bulls. It might be pronounced right. Adelbiz. Okay. Why do they call you the Minotaur of Milwaukee? The they there is people on 4chan. I don't know anybody outside of that who's calling me the Minotaur of Milwaukee, other than my wife, who thinks it's very funny. It's in part because I'm a big guy, and there are some photos where it's usually I'm like standing next to somebody who's smaller and I look very large, right? And I am a big guy. I'm 6'3", you know, I'm close to 300 pounds. Since I've been working out, by the way, I have been like shedding fat and gaining muscle and have lost 0 pounds. I've just got closer to 300. And so maybe that's part of it. Maybe it's also something to do with the maze, notion that I help get you through the maze. Although the Minotaur doesn't help get you through the maze, the Minotaur kills you in the middle of the maze. So I'm not sure that's such a great thing. But it's kind of a cool thing. Somebody created, they must have photoshopped it, a photo with me lecturing one of my very first lectures. They put a Minotaur head on there. So it's just kind of a fun thing. It'd be better to ask the guys who actually started doing that, but I don't know if you can figure out who that is. All right, Tomikuz, Dr. Sadler, just skipped up a bit. Is it possible to conceive of such a thing as revolutionary Stoicism? There's Cato, but I'm thinking of someone that wants to change the world. There's plenty of revolutionary Stoics out there. There's plenty. So Stoicism itself stresses justice, and we're constantly having these discussions within the Stoic forums about should Stoicism be left-wing or right-wing or something like that. My answer is it shouldn't be any wing. Just like Aristotelianism, if you're an Aristotelian, you're not going to be happy with either of our current parties or with the left or the right, but you are going to work your ass off for making the world a better place. And you're probably going to have to ally from time to time with various, less philosophical, more ideological people, posing themselves in different places in the culture and political wars that we're going through, right? Cato was not revolutionary. Cato was, in many respects, a conservative, right? He wanted to preserve the republic. He, at one time, was willing to go and kill Sulla when he was a young kid. But it is certainly possible to combine Stoicism to some degree with things that people would consider revolutionary. I think that the very act of being a virtue ethicist and trying to practice that sort of thing is inherently revolutionary, but it's not revolutionary on the spectrum that people are used to. But that's my take. Nicola, what about hedonism and Epicurus? Yeah, it's a good question. So Epicurus thought that the body and the mind, again, materialists like the Stoics, but we can distinguish bodily and mental pleasures. Mental pleasures, Epicurus thought, are much better, much more important. Mental pains are much worse. So that's where we should be putting our emphasis. We care for the body so that we can have as pleasant and prudent and just a life as possible. That's really the Epicurean tradition right there. And there are quite a few contemporary Epicureans out there. It's not as big as the modern Stoic movement, but it's big. It's bigger than the modern Aristotelian or Platonist movement, right? So that's well worth looking into. Reed, given this talk about hurting your body, there's also ample scientific evidence sedentary lifestyles are correlated to more health problems later on. Isn't exercise still better? But nobody said exercise wasn't still better. So I'm not sure what this is about. Exercise often does hurt, but it hurts so that you can build. If you're doing it to the point where you're just hurting yourself, you're probably doing it wrong, So yeah, you should exercise. There were some people who have thought like you only start out with a certain amount of like bodily energy, and so don't use it all up. And that just turns out to be wrong physiologically. If you had that point of view and that was right, then probably you shouldn't exercise. But we know now that you should. All right. Democritus. How did medieval and Renaissance Christians take care of their bodies, assuming they inherited the ideas of Plato? That's a big assumption there. They didn't inherit the ideas of Plato. Many of them, exercised. A lot of them exercised just by virtue of not having cars to drive them around, or having manual labor to do. So, and then there's like personal hygiene. It's kind of a myth that nobody bathed during the Middle Ages. All you got to do is read some medieval literature to realize that's not true at all. Different people did different things. This is something somebody could write an entire book on, and I'm sure somebody has out there. Jeff, anything in Plato on diet or exercise? Platonism seems to have a pretty negative image of the body, yet Plato himself was a wrestler. It's not a negative image of the body. It's a view that the body is kind of a trap for the soul, and so you do take care of it. Anything in Plato on diet or exercise? Yeah, there's plenty of discussions about diet throughout the dialogues. You'll see it referenced almost constantly. Medicine is the discipline that handles that. The Gorgias actually makes a big distinction between medicine and cookery. So probably want to look around in there. And the Republic has discussions of diet and exercise as well, for these guardians. So yeah, there's tons of stuff. But then there's Plato, and then there's the Platonic tradition, right? So you could also look at Plutarch. Plutarch is a Platonist. Philo of Alexandria is a Neoplatonist. See what they have to say. There's all sorts of interesting things. JR, I don't understand how the Stoics can think we're not our body or some synthesis of body and soul. We die without it and have to admit that health, drugs, etc., can impair our mental faculties. I think you must have misheard. The Stoics don't think we're not our body. We're not just our body, right? We are material. There's also something which they called pneuma or spirit. And that's also material, and that's also within us. We're not just the body as, say, scientific medicine understands it. Obviously, the Stoics think that the body affects, the mind and vice versa. All you got to do is read around a little bit in there. And they certainly admit that health, drugs, et cetera, impair our mental faculties and vice versa. If you're using drugs, who decided to use them? But that's not even just the Stoics. Aristotle would say that sort of thing. So, all right. Something here about breathing. I'm just going to skip over that. All right. Here's something from Erysichthon. So I was thinking about the relationship between a philosopher and his body and the usage of the body as a device of hermeneutics, so interpretation, right? Sometimes historians of philosophy do emphasize the body effects on the philosopher, like in Nietzsche's case. Do you think all historians of philosophy should do more of that? No. Different historians of philosophy are working on different things. Some are just trying to elaborate the sort of coherent internal structure of the ideas. Some are trying to make cases about how social dynamics are affecting a philosopher's thought and vice versa. Some are interested in, much more biographical things, and those who are interested in that may focus very much on the body. Some of them may focus less. I think it's a mistake to try to reduce people to their biography. People say, well, Nietzsche had syphilis at this time, and that's why he wrote this stuff. Well, people also said that about Merleau-Ponty's Visible and the Invisible. He wasn't getting enough blood to his brain. Those are so reductive, and they're not borne out by the texts. They're not borne out by what we see. There's no, intrinsic relation between having this disorder and writing this sort of thing. William James, by the way, has a great piece discussing that. He himself had a mental breakdown at one time. You'll find discussion of that in his Varieties of Religious Experience, as well as in other things as well. But yeah, should we interpret things in terms of the body? Yeah, except that we don't have access to people's bodies who've been dead for a long time, so it's not like we get these very broad brush depictions of them. Think about Socrates, for example. A lot of endurance, could stand the heat and the cold. Never got drunk, even though he drank as much as everybody else. Ugly, short, squat, all this sort of stuff. Does that really tell you that much about him? Nietzsche himself does engage in quite a bit of this. Well, this is where Socrates' ideas came from because he was this and that. That's one of the weaker aspects of Nietzsche's work, I think. The reduction to these just temperaments or bodies or things like that. Let me go on. Adam, what are your thoughts on Taoism? Do you think reducing our self-consciousness can make our lives easier? So 2 different questions. Taoism is an interesting tradition, which I've taught, when I teach world religions classes or Eastern religion / philosophy classes, which I haven't done for a while. It's not, it's one that there's so many Taoist texts out there, classic Taoist texts, that you could spend the rest of your life reading them. It's not just the, Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi or something like that. There's all this other great stuff out there, but I've myself only scratched the surface in it. And it's not something I'm really attracted to. So I don't have a lot to say about it. Do I think reducing our self-consciousness can make our lives easier? It depends on the life, and it depends on the self-consciousness. Some people need to be more self-conscious, I think. Some people need to be less. Some people need to be self-conscious to the same degree that they are, but perhaps about different stuff or in a different way. So I don't think that just reducing our self-consciousness is a panacea for the problems of our lives. Corbo, I worked in a gas station for 6 months doing openings from 4 a.m. to 13 p.m., 1 p.m. full time. It was really exhausting. I didn't have the energy to do anything after work except drink and sleep. Yeah, I've worked jobs like that myself. I worked third shift security, worked a lot of weird shifts. I worked in a gas station second shift, and same sort of deal. But it could also be the work. I mean, working in a gas station / convenience store, not a fun job, really. Lot of weird stresses, that you get. All right. Let's see here. Name me 007, most overrated philosopher of all time in your opinion. Man, that's kind of tough to say. I mean, I wouldn't know who to place in that. That's a great question, though. Who is the most overrated philosopher of all time? I think that at any given time, there's usually a lot of people that are getting a lot of press and being talked up a lot. This is, again, where historical perspective, just reading a lot in the history of ideas is quite important. You see that there's people who are like big stuff in their own time, and now nobody except for a few, scholars talk about them at all. And that's pretty frequent. That happens generation after generation after generation. So, yeah. Adam, how would you define wisdom? I'm not a definition guy, and I generally don't try to do stuff like that. So there's plenty of definitions out there. Seneca, we were just reading one recently in the Stoic Fellowship, but I don't have one available for you. What color are my eyes? Green. The sort of brownish green. Here's a good one from JR. Did Epicureans really believe a wise man on the rack and the Bullet Florist would say, how delightful this is, how little I care for it, or was that tongue-in-cheek? I think that's more tongue-in-cheek than anything else. Because, the Bullet Florist, for those of you who don't know, it was a torture device, and it was a bowl that you'd stick a human being into, and then you'd basically roast them from the, you'd put a fire in it and roast them inside of it, and there's screams where there was a musical apparatus set up in such a way their screams came out sounding like beautiful music or something like that. And Phalaris apparently was one hell of a jerk. I think at one point he wound up in his own bowl, which is not quite poetic justice given how many victims he had. But I think that the Stoics also are saying stuff like that. I don't think they're really. Either they were really convinced of that, in which case that's pretty implausible, or maybe it was kind of joking around. All right. I'm going to skip through some of the joking that's going on here, which is perfectly fine. 045. Sartre is influenced a lot by Heidegger. Where do you agree more with Sartre than his influence for Being and Time and other Heidegger works? Where do you agree more with Sartre than his influence for Being and Time? I'm not quite, I don't, from Being in Time? Okay. Well, so I'll just say one thing right off the bat. So Sartre, and you know, if you read like Heidegger's letter on humanism, you'll see Heidegger criticizing Sartre about this. Sartre is much more humanocentric. He really does think existentialism is a humanism. And when Heidegger finds out that existentialism, that Sartre is using existentialism that way, he's like, I don't need the word. You go ahead and use it. You keep it. Sartre, by the way, kind of did that with other people. Gabriel Marcel ends up saying, Sartre is so taken over the word. I'm not going to bother using it. I'm just going to call what I do, philosophy of existence or Christian Socraticism or something like that. With Sartre, there definitely is a much more concerted focus on the human being as the locus of things. Heidegger thinks that that's kind of a mistake. The earlier work is much more humanocentric. The later work, it's much more about how we get out of our own way in relating to being, which is why I think Eastern philosophers sometimes, saw connections between Heidegger and various ways of looking at things, say in Chinese philosophy and Japanese philosophy. But yeah, I mean, that's probably about enough for this, because there's a lot of other things. I mean, Sartre says that Heidegger didn't quite get nothingness right. That's in the very early part of Being and Nothingness. All right, there's stuff about exercise that people are writing. I'm going to skip over. Signor Pomodoro. What do you think of Anthony Kenny's position that the Eudemian ethics is the more mature work of Aristotle's ethics? More mature, that is, than the Nicomachean ethics. I don't really have a view on this, but let's sort of summarize this and what the controversy is for people who aren't familiar with this. So there's a general consensus among Aristotle's scholarship that wants to say that the Eudemian ethics, he wrote two different ethics, the Eudemian ethics and the Nicomachean ethics, and three of the books of those two ethics are the same, but they do differ in like the books at the start and the books at the end. Most of the Aristotle scholars who actually take a position on this, I'm not a scholar who does take a position, but most of them who do take a position think the Nicomachean ethics is the more mature work, that Aristotle was still more influenced by Plato at the time that he's writing the Eudemian ethics. And their evidence for this is usually like, well, he didn't talk about this, and he talked about this in a more Platonic way. Kennedy says, no, the Eudemian ethics is actually more mature. It's showing greater development in some ways. I'm always suspicious of these arguments from development, in part because I look, they are often quite circular in terms of stylistics and what we're supposed to be looking for there. By the way, Plato scholarship is terrible on that, right? We have the early dialogues, middle dialogues, late dialogues. I mean, we can agree that some of them definitely are late, some of them are definitely early, but where the hell the rest of them fit in, tough to say. I think that for me, I'm less interested in saying which is the more mature work. I'm interested in taking Aristotle's works and reading them systematically. So the Eudemian and Nicomachean ethics, if I'm working on Aristotle's views on friendship, I'm drawing on both of them, and the politics, and the topics, and the rhetoric, because I don't want to leave stuff out, right? I'm not just going to be like, well, only the most mature works for me, but I think there's a lot of people who are that way. So, all right. I'm not sure I understand this question. Nimi07, do you agree with critics of Germany for making statues of Marx? I mean, you can make statues of anybody you like, I guess, but I don't know. Are there recent statues that people are worked up about? Can I talk about body image and what role it should play in your lifestyle? Well, that's a good question, right? So everybody's got a body image, and it can be very distorted, right? People who, there's a thing called body dysmorphia. It's a psychological disorder called by different things in different diagnostic manuals, because not everybody uses the DSM. There's different traditions across the world. But the idea is that you look at yourself and you see something that's not there. So I could have a body dysmorphia of like looking at my nose and thinking my nose looks like crap. It's so squat, right? Like, let's say I'd actually see it and it's kind of squished in like this, but it's not really. It looks just the way it does. I'm just having a distorted view of it. That's a real problem, and a lot of people like look in the mirror and they're very buff and they think I'm so skinny, or they look in the mirror and they're very thin and they're like, God, I'm so fat, or I'm ugly, or I'm this or that. And being able to actually see yourself as you are, that's pretty important. The other thing that I think is really important is having realistic expectations about your body image. And we live in a society that's constantly feeding us crap models for what our body image ought to be. So that's a significant issue, and that does lead to health problems. I mean, sometimes it leads to over-exercising, it leads to eating disorders, it leads to people having all sorts of anxiety, which prevents them from getting good sleep. So yeah. Let's see here. And we're going a little over time, but I'll try to address the questions that I've got left. How do I counter this from Valdemar? How do you counter the common idea conclusion of disregarding all the work of a thinker just because of some of what they say is absurd, being a product of their time? At this point in my career, I just ignore people who do that, because it's not worth the time. I have limited time. It's not worth the time for me to try to convince them that that's a foolish position to take. Very often you're not going to actually reach them. I mean, if let's say you have a friend or a classmate or a family member and you really want to invest the time in doing that, you just say, listen, you're committing a fallacy by doing this, right? And you can look in the fallacies and see which one it is. It might be a variation of ad hominem. Could be, insufficient sample if you're thinking about it inductively. So yeah. Bailey, would you be willing to speak on Schopenhauer's influence on Nietzsche as well as the relevance of Schopenhauer in studying philosophy? So much more early on stuff, the Birth of Tragedy, clearly influenced by Schopenhauer. There's references to Schopenhauer in there. The notion of music as being sort of the thing that you're going to get at the metaphysics with. But I think over time, the notion of will as being central too is also pretty important. But over time, there's less and less influence, I'd say. Advice for someone finally embracing their passion for philosophy in their mid-20s. Do I know any other late bloomers, perhaps colleagues or acquaintances, who found themselves in a similar situation? Many, many, many people. Some of them are my students. In fact, when you look at the comments on the YouTube videos, there's a lot of people in that boat who couldn't study philosophy, or when they did study philosophy, it was with some jerk who taught an intro class and talked down to the students and didn't want to help them out with anything and like turn them off on it. So here, yeah, a bit of advice. As a matter of fact, I did a guest blog post and an interview with Leah Goldrick about this recently. So I would take a look at those. It's like under 10 philosophical works you should read. But there's also some other stuff in there as well, some good advice. Don't expect to read everything. You don't have to read everything. You can't. And expect to read and reread and reread. if you don't understand it at first, that's a-okay. That's par for the course. That's the way it works. Some days I get in front of the chalkboard and I've got all the notes on the board, and I've got my book in front of me, and I'm like, oh, I lost my train of thought and I can't figure out what I'm actually saying here. Francis, I feel like a lot of philosophers are content to spin their wheels in mediocrity. They don't even want to push their intellectual achievements to a higher level. How can we go further? I don't know that there's like a single answer to that. I myself, I get a lot out of reading other people and seeing what they have to say. I don't think it's awfully important to try to strive to be original. There's so many great thoughts out there, just being able to understand what Aristotle is actually saying and see the world for a while through that perspective and say a few intelligent things about it. That's pretty good for me. That's not mediocre. But there are a lot of people who are pretty mediocre in the field at present. I think that's often because they just like only focus on this little bit here. And there's quite a few just also who don't really have whatever the passion is that drives you into philosophy, they just don't have it. They just, got into it and then wound up being lucky enough in the academic lottery to get a teaching position. Lukey, where are we in contemporary times in regards to dualism? Have we made any progress? How does that relate to the new We Are One movement, which appears to be little to the other extreme? I don't know what the new We Are One movement is, but is there progress? Yeah, I think it's progress that not too many people take Cartesianism, and that includes Spinoza, by the way, because Spinoza is a Cartesian at first, all that seriously. We learned some things along the way, but we tend to make the same mistakes over and over again. So you see the same sort of positivistic stuff getting bandied around as like, this is the new philosophy. Just they sprinkle in neuroscience instead of the stuff from the 1850s. And we're going to keep making the same mistakes because we're kind of a dumb species that way, especially the intellectuals. So, all right, Adam, this is a good point. People underestimate the power of just doing it. Should there be any limit of thinking before acting? Yeah, there should be plenty of limits of thinking before acting. You probably should try to think out what you're doing before you do it, because otherwise just doing it can wind you up in all sorts of stuff. That's how you wake up, like in bed with somebody the next morning wondering where the hell you are and how the hell you got there and who the hell this person is, around bar when you just did it around bar time. People do those sorts of things. It's not just in movies, right? So there's all sorts of things where we should actually exercise some prudence. I think that what's important is that we not be like sort of hyper intellectual, but we find good ways to integrate action and thinking. And remember, thinking is an action too. So, Andre, what do you think of Montaigne? I like Miguel de Montaigne, and he's kind of interesting. And he's one of the people, if I ever do get around to like writing a sort of a history of anger, he's got a great essay on that. Daniel asked, what are my personal strength records? I don't have those. I don't keep track of that sort of stuff. I don't care at all about that. I never even did when I was working out as a young man, because I was doing endurance lifting, not trying to do power lifting, right? Endurance lifting is where you do long sets, many of them medium weights. You're never trying to max anything out. I would actually spend on my arm and chest days, I would actually spend an hour doing a bench pyramid with that, but I never got anywhere near trying to max anything out. I view that as like, I'm not going to say it's just pure bullshit, right? But it's kind of like getting the cart before the horse. The goal is to have a strong, healthy body. It's not about trying to set records or anything like that. All right. Let's see here about Garrett says, why does Kierkegaard believe Christianity discovered something other religions have not? Kierkegaard doesn't really talk much about other religions, for one thing, but he does think that Christianity introduces something new to the world. It's in part through the intercessor, right? Probably one of the best places to go look for this discussion of that is the philosophical fragments, the discussion between the Socrates figure, and who's doing about as much as you can do just humanly, and then the Redeemer figure who intrudes, this intrusion of the internal into the temporal, and teaches stuff that goes beyond. Could you not adapt that into other religious perspectives, like say Buddhism? I think you could probably, but Kierkegaard just doesn't do that. Okay. So Nimi has a thing about the Marx thing. There are many Marx monuments in Germany. A new one has recently been made for his 200th birthday. Many people are storming that Marx and his ideas are responsible for the deaths of 100 million people. Well, I mean, I'd say Stalin's more responsible for that. I'd say Mao's more responsible for that, wouldn't you? I mean, you can find all sorts of ideas and hold people accountable in kind of tenuous ways. Was Stalin sort of faithful to Marx's perspective? I don't know. What have you read Marx? Because I don't see a lot of genuine Marxist praxis in Stalinism. I know the Stalinists at the time claimed that, but their claims are always tenuous and being combated by other Marxists who are like, this is kind of bullshit. But this isn't something I actually have to have a position on myself. Well, Petros, what advice would you give to someone who will start studying philosophy in university with the hope of becoming a university professor? The biggest bit of advice, get used to rejection and disappointment, because it's tough to get a position. And you got to do a lot of work, jump through a lot of arbitrary hoops, and you may still not get a position, unfortunately. I do have a video out there, advice about becoming a university professor, that you can take a look at. Everything that I said in there is, I stand by it today. So, all right, T-Care. I feel perfect in God's image. I've reached every goal I wished for, asked for. When I think of myself, mind, body, soul, love myself, tell myself I'm thankful for me. Well, that's, like we say, good work if you can get it, right? So that's good. Written, have you ever glanced at ancient Indian texts such as Adi Shankara view on the self? His school of thought has greatly awoken the non-dualist movements. Yeah, so we're talking about Vedanta here, right? And yeah, I've read ancient Indian texts. I've taught them in classes, not for quite a while, but there's all sorts of non-dualism out there, so that's good. And Keyses, you could say Hegel and Epicurus were responsible for the atrocities in Russia and China for their influence on Marx. I guess so. I mean, now we're getting to the point of the ridiculous. And yeah, holding Marx accountable for 100 million deaths, like holding Adam Smith responsible for the Irish potato famine. You can find, yeah, so this is a great point. People who are going to be, I'm not just going to say jerks or assholes or something like this. People who are going to be monsters, moral monsters to other people, are going to do so through whatever ideology they can find. Stalin would have been an asshole, a terrible person, whether he was in sort of a Germany of the Weimar Republic and got drawn into, say, the Nazi movement, or whether he found Marxism to be the vehicle for that sort of thing. Most of those sorts of people, it's not just the influence of those ideas and they're acting like puppets. They are horrible people. And you could say, what is it about, some ideas or ideologies that allows it? But it's always much more than that. It's always like the social matrix. And it's very easy to do this. Well, so this is responsible for this. It's not such a direct conclusion most of the time. Really, BK, will I consider doing more literature lectures like the Kafka videos? Yeah, I certainly will. What other current lit writers do you enjoy? Well, I've been doing the science fiction and fantasy sequence for quite a while. You can see a lot of people I enjoy with that. I've been meaning to do stuff on not just Kafka, but Dostoevsky. That's actually, by the way, in there for the Patreon. goals. Eventually I'm going to restart doing videos in that existentialism series once I've reached a certain level of support, because that is what allows me to have the free time not to be hustling after client appointments and things like that, to be able to do more video work and now podcast work as well. So yeah. All right, take care. My husband is a professor, has worked as an electrician, millwright, and gas fitter. A good dad. We all have quirks, I think it is. I know what you mean. He went white hair and bald in his 20s, no addiction. Yeah, my adoptive dad actually started going white in his teens, I think. And by the time that he died at 36, it was all white. Yeah. So yeah, it's interesting. I would rather take classes, I think. This is a bit off topic. I would rather take classes with somebody who's actually got some outside the academy life experience. I'd probably rather take classes from somebody who didn't come up within elite institutions than I'd rather take them with people who actually went to more down homey institutions and had to fight for getting the positions that they did, because you probably get more out of it. I don't know. That's just me. All right, Daniel asked this on a video. Do you think saying God acts as efficient cause within secondary causality of Jesus' resurrection reduces God to a being instead of being itself? I don't even work in that frame of metaphysics. So I don't really have an answer to that, quite frankly. It's not something I've given much thought to for years and years and years. All right, I'm going to take one more. Thomas O'Malley's. Is it dumb to justify not getting a job for the summer with philosophy, being genuine in the Heideggerian sense or something like that? I mean, I don't think that this has anything to do with Heideggerian authenticity. If you want a job in the summer and a job is available, you choose whether you take on the job or not. If you have other priorities, you deal with those things. I don't see this as something that requires. It's really a matter of what you want to do and your finances more than anything else. I don't think that this requires practical philosophy to decide. I'll tell you, I work year round. I take very few vacations. I do some academic teaching, and that's sort of feast or famine. I'll be teaching 4 classes next semester for 3 different institutions, one of them online, 2 of them right here in Milwaukee, fortunately just blocks away. But a gig is a gig. You have to decide whether it's good for you or not. So, all right, I'm going to sign off. We're about 20 minutes over. I want to spend some time over the rest of the weekend with my kids before I take them back to their home, and I won't see them again until July. So great questions, everybody. We didn't actually talk that much about the body, I think, but we had a lot of good questions and comments. So thanks for all of that. Thanks to my Patreon supporters, and hope you guys have a great Father's Day weekend.